Greetings and a warm welcome to all participants today from wherever you're joining us for the session entitled Ensuring School Meals Are More Responsive to Local Markets, Agrobiodiversity and Climate. And I would especially give a vote of thanks to speakers and panelists who are joining us from the Americas today, where I believe that day is just dawning. So thank you for availing yourselves and making this special effort. My name is Teresa Borelli from the Alliance of Biodiversity International in SEAT, and I will be your moderator for this session today. But before I continue, I'd like to inform participants that language interpretation has been provided kindly by the organizers in French and Spanish. So if you would like to switch language, now is the time to do so. And you can do so by clicking on the globe icon at the bottom of your screen where it says interpretation. And for the same reason, I would also like to ask speakers and panel members to be mindful of interpreters and ensure they try and speak more slowly. And I should also remind myself for accurate interpretation. Because we're a little bit tight in the session, full bios of the speakers and panelists will be provided as in the chat box as the session progresses and speakers come on. And so just to start the session, I would like to just introduce what you're to expect today. So the session will be divided into two portions. The first half of the session will help us set the scene a little bit, looking at what we know about the status quo of school meal programs and how they're currently helping us deliver on national and international targets at multiple levels to improve nutrition, health, learning, gender equalities, local economies, and promote sustainable agriculture. In this first half of the session, we will also explore evidence of impact in different homegrown school feeding models in several countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. And we will also have the pleasure of having a sneak preview at a qualitative tool that was developed by the Alliance to measure impact on additional domains and across actors engaged in the school feeding value chain. So for those of you who are not familiar with the term homegrown school feeding, it refers to schemes where the demand for food and services for school meals is channeled via smallholders and other local supply chain actors with a specific intention of stimulating agricultural productivity, increase income, and improve food security at the local and community level. So building on these results, the second half of the session will be taken up by a high-level panel discussion where invited speakers will be asked to comment on ongoing challenges for decision-making, policies and future design and implementation of homegrown school feeding models and getting these models to scale. If time allows, we'll also be taking questions at the end of the session. But if you have any pressing questions, just post them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, kindly indicating to whom the question is being addressed. And hopefully we will have time to accommodate 2 or 3 questions selected by the session organizers. If not, the Secretariat, I hope, will kindly be able to provide us with your emails for follow-up. So with no further ado, to start setting the scene, I would like to invite you to watch a short video of a homegrown school feeding pilot that was implemented in Busia County, Kenya, Western Kenya, by the Alliance, along with national partner Calro. So over to you, Sharon, to show the video.
we are also planning a back at our homes and then at school here. So we get knowledge here, we eat at school here, and then when you go back at home, we also need that.
At the same time, it is a cheaper solution because it's something we are growing on the school compound and taking it directly to the kitchen, and it's being used within the school compound. The students have embraced the meal and they really like it. In fact, they prefer it to the other vegetables like kales and cabbages.
Thank you, Sharon, and I hope you enjoyed the video. I will now ask Professor Donald Bundy from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and Director of the Global Research Consortium for School Health and Nutrition to provide a brief overview of where we are in successfully implementing homegrown school feeding models and what are the barriers for greater acceptance of homegrown school feeding. Don, welcome, and the floor is yours. You've got 5 minutes.
That's great, and I think you've got some slides for me if you can put those up as well. You know, we're a year now into the School Meals Coalition, and you know there's been real enthusiasm for this. 73 countries have signed up to the coalition, and just to put that in perspective, with SUN, the Scaling Up Nutrition, it took over 12 years, 65 countries signed up, and with the GFF, over 7 years, 36 countries. It's just to make the point that this is really something that people countries are pushing for. And that the countries identified 3 clear goals a year ago to restore coverage of programs to pre-COVID levels. So to get back from 400 million pre-COVID to get back from 0. To expand those programs to reach the 73 million children that hadn't been reached previously, and to make them stronger programs, to include agriculture and food in the thinking about them in particular. And so we've seen some huge progress, and many people already aware Rwanda has gone from 600,000 children being fed to 3 million. The Benin has committed to provide $250 million for school meals programs over the next 5 years. And the latest data that are just being processed now on surveys suggests that we're not back to 400 million maybe yet, but we're certainly somewhere around 350 million coverage. So dramatic improvements over the course of the year. And the research consortium was set up to provide credible evidence to support guidance for governments in achieving these goals. And if I could just have the next slide, please, to talk about the structure of the research consortium, this initiative of the School Meals Coalition. Just to say, so we have the School Meals Coalition, the 73 countries on top. We have a tiny secretariat at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, but all the work is done by communities of practice, global communities of practice. And that's really what I wanted to focus on, because the point I wanted to make here is that the traditional focus around school meals on health, on education, and on how best to do it, and on nutrition and so forth, have not been kept up with by food and food systems thinking. We haven't brought that in properly into the consortium. So have the next slide, please. The intention now is to have a new diet and food systems community of practice. And for this to work, we need to reach out to all of you guys on this call who are in that system. We need to bring you much more closely into the processes if you're willing to join in on this. You know, next week, after this School Meals Coalition week, we're going to have in Helsinki the first ministerial meeting where we'll be taking stock, the ministers will be taking stock on what's been done this year. and we're seeing real operational progress. But I think one of the cases that we really need to make at that meeting is to say that we need to also be focusing on diet and food systems, on agriculture in ways in which we've not been pushing up till now. I just want to say also, if I could have the next slide, please, that we have produced a statement. Oh, maybe it's not there. Okay. We have produced a statement that's been circulated to all of the countries that are participating, and you can find that on our website. And we will be talking through with the ministers about that. And I would love to hear from you today as we discuss these issues, how better we can include food and food systems and diet issues in our communities of practice going forward. We need your help, is what I'm basically saying. So thank you for the opportunity to join this call, and I hope that it will flow out so that in a year's time, when we meet again, we will see diet and food systems very much at the top of the agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. And so it's really interesting what you're saying about the need to provide credible evidence and analytics and metrics to convince people that homegrown school feeding works. And I think this segues nicely into the next set of scene setting exercise. So I would like to move to the presentations now that illustrate the results of a recent assessment on the available evidence and gaps, I should underline, of the impacts of homegrown school feeding in 12 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. This is a result of recent work that the Alliance undertook with support from the World Food Programme. And I would like to welcome the first presenter, my colleague Sarah Ranking. Sarah is a research associate with the Food Environment and Consumer Behavior Division of the Alliance. Sarah, the floor is yours. You have 10 minutes for your presentation. Over.
Well, oh my, from the Alliance.
We can't hear you very well.
And can you hear me?
A little bit better now.
Okay. So as I was saying, I'm part of the research team from the Alliance. Church of Study. Now, overview our main barriers.
Sarah, you're cutting. I don't know if it's just me or can the other presenters hear her well?
Can you go into the next slide?
Yeah.
Can you hear me fine? Wow.
Hi, Sarah. You're cracking a bit, but we can catch a few sentences. So
maybe if I turn on my video.
Yep, we can try that.
Hear me better now?
Maybe keep talking for a sec.
Okay. So, can you go to the back? Next slide.
Oh, sorry. No, I think it's still cracking for me. What about the rest of the panel?
Same.
Yeah.
Sarah, do you have
There,
like headphones you could
can you
try?
hear me? Yes, I'm using headphones right now.
We can hear you much better now. So
Okay,
please
awesome.
go ahead.
Can you go to the previous slide, please? Okay, so what we did on the first phase of this study was to consolidate evidence on past or current school feeding programs linked to local food production or homegrown school feeding programs, as Teresa was explaining, from 12 countries of the Latin American and Caribbean region that are part of WFP network. These included data, perceptions, lessons learned, and of course, evidence of impacts from Bolivia, Brazil, Colombia, Cuba, Dominican Republic, Ecuador, El Salvador, Guatemala, Haiti, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Peru. On the second phase, we developed an adapted analytical framework to capture some evidence of actual impacts, both in the short and long term, of these homegrown school feeding models on diverse beneficiaries, but this will be presented next by my colleague Osana Bonilla. And last, 4 country-specific deep dives of homegrown school feeding programs and their impacts were undertaken in 4 countries: it's Colombia, Honduras, Guatemala, and Haiti, using this adapted analytical framework as a tryout. So let me just show you some of what we found. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is a regional overview. As you can see on this map, homegrown school feeding is a growing trend in the region. 9 out of the 12 countries studied have either homegrown school feeding programs in a scaling up process or a program already implemented at a regional or national level. All 12 countries had at least one pilot project linking smallholder producers to local schools, most of them supported by WFP, but it's in the scaling up process where most of the challenges are encountered. We found good advances in terms of policy frameworks. There have been several national laws and policies fostering, recommending, and even enforcing local smallholders' purchases to supply school feeding programs. However, the operationalization of these laws is either happening slowly or not happening at all. There are few consolidated cases where there is a quality quantified data and impact evidence. In fact, this study found a consistent lack of monitoring systems, agreed metrics and indicators, and data collection in general on impacts from past or ongoing homegrown school feeding initiatives in the region. Nicaragua and Ecuador, as you can see, remain with a centralized program at a national level. However, in the case of Ecuador, there is a transition process underway towards the centralization. Cuba, Haiti, Dominican Republic, Honduras, and El Salvador have decentralized models already with different scales of implementation, mostly small scale pilots projects. The rest of the countries, Bolivia, Brazil, Peru, Colombia, Guatemala, have hybrid programs, mixing centralized purchases and management of the school feeding program with decentralization through territorial or local management and purchasing units that in some cases are linked to local smallholder producers. Next, please. Okay, so these are the 3 next slides are examples of the 3 models identified, just to highlight some features in terms of country achievements and remaining challenges from each modality. So just an example of a decentralized model is Guatemala. It's a relatively successful homegrown school feeding national case, achieving positive results in terms of improving school attendance while focusing on improving students' nutrition and seeking to increase at the same time agricultural economic development. So far, 35% of purchases for school feeding comes from family farming. The goal is 50%, so they are in really good progress. One of the difficulties identified in Guatemala is the lack of research and quantitative data on the benefits, bottlenecks, and challenges of the program that are not being collected despite the program good results. Next slide, please. The next one is an example of a hybrid model or a mixed model. So it is the case of Honduras, where National School Feeding Program transfers money to WFP for the purchase and delivery of dry rations to the mancomunidades for fresh rations sourced from family farming, especially in the dry corridor and the Mosquitia region. Mancomunidades are commonwealths, organizations legally constituted by a group of municipalities. And so WFP has supported and trained the mancomunidades to be able to establish commercial agreements with the government and to execute the program directly. One of the biggest challenges in this modality in Honduras is the program sustainability after every government change. And due to COVID, since 2020, the delivery of fresh food was suspended. It hasn't been restabled, at least not until the time of the interview of this study were conducted. Next slide, please. The last one is an example of the centralized model, So although Nicaragua remains in this model, the country has national coverage of the total of schools through an optimized logistic system that delivers only dry rations, but some of these grains are actually from local organizations and smallholders associations linked to a WFP program. So it is a centralized model, but has achieved to link some of locally produced food. In the case of Nicaragua, since it's a centralized model, there's not a policy framework to promote homegrown school feeding, neither budget lines or the capacity for implementation at the state level. There is also no experience in the autonomous management of resources by municipalities or schools, and the country has regions with low productive vocation, among other challenges. And next one, please. So to no, there's a previous one. Yeah, thank you. So to conclude, these are some of the main barriers and limitations identified in general terms, in general terms, sorry, in the country's study. There are still major barriers in terms of existing capacities from small producers to respond to the demands of the school market and the complexity of public procurement systems, as well as lack of infrastructure and economic resources to ensure a stable and continuous production and delivery of fresh food, yeah. And if the purchasing decision is made based on prices, in most cases, small producers' prices can't compete with those from large producers or imports. And of course, we can't stress enough on the little evidence that is being collected on the impact of these models on nutrition, education, economic, and social development. This also contributes to the lack of knowledge of the transformative potential they can have and the different areas they can impact. Most of the information and evidence available remains very anecdotal and qualitative, highlighting a major gap in the quantitative backstopping of the model. Although sustainable procurement is almost always portrayed as a win-win model across the school food value chain, there is a gap of evidence on the economic benefits to smallholders and local farmer organizations linked to homegrown school feeding supply chains, as well as a major lack of information on how these models and programs are impacting or influenced by school food environments and how they are contributing to consumer behavior change or not. So these are some of the questions we have. We hope we'll be able to answer in future studies. Thank you.
Thank you, Sara, for this comprehensive presentation. And thank you for highlighting some of the barriers and limitations that are either on the procurement side, so procurement policies that are not open to small-scale farmers, but also on the production side about what's the limitations that small-scale farmers face to compete and to produce fresh produce for the school meals. And then the last thing that we are talking about in this session is about the lack of evidence. And for this next session, I would also like to complete the scene setting. I would invite my colleague Osana Bonilla-Finji to showcase this adapted, we call it analytical framework, but maybe it's better to call it a qualitative tool that was developed by the Alliance as part of the assessment to measure the impact of homegrown school feeding. Osana is a scientist of the Alliance working across two research areas, climate action and food environment and consumer behavior. Osana, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Teresa. Can you hear me well?
Yes, absolutely. Copying you loud and clear.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So yeah, in the next couple of minutes, I will present you and share with you a bit the second stream of this work. As mentioned by Sara, undertaking covering 12 Latin American countries, which also actually led us to develop this framework to help assess homegrown school feeding impacts. So as we went through the design—
Osana, can I just ask you to blow it up, because we're seeing your notes as well. So
Oh,
maybe
sorry.
you could, no, so you could maybe put it full screen.
Yeah, probably I'm in the wrong, give me just a sec. In the wrong panel. My God, where is it?
Or you can revert to the previous one if you think, if you're more comfortable.
It's
with
in
that.
the other, wait, it's in the other screen, that's why. Is it better now?
Yeah, perfect. We can see it full blown now. Thank you.
So, sorry for this. So I was saying that when we start to develop this framework, this analytical framework, as mentioned in your previous presentation, it was core to us to make it in a way that it could really make evidence on what is actually the scope, what should be the scope of the framework, in the sense of focusing on the large range of beneficiaries that are related to the homegrown school feeding programs, which actually not only includes the children and the schools, as we know, but also the key players that are somehow behind at the basis and along the local value chains, and also beyond the school doors. So all the households and communities, as well as the civil society. So then also, it was key to us to highlight the links of homegrown school feeding with the local food system. And for that, we identify some of its key components, so food environment and food supply chain, which at the same time do influence the implementation of homegrown school feedings, but also are influenced by those to enable healthy diets, nutrition and sustainable consumer behavior choices, but also all these broader outcomes that we have been mentioning before and that are not often mapped out. So then with these building blocks, we structured the proposed framework, and we included then 6 big impact areas that then should be reflected or displayed to focus on both short-term outcomes and also should allow us to reflect the long-term impacts. And a key element also that we defined was key to include, and that came also from the study, from the evidence gathered, and from the interviews undertaken with the colleagues of WFP Latin America, was this need of assessing also the importance of including cross-cutting issues such as women and youth, the knowledge and the role of indigenous communities as custodians of this agrobiodiversity, including also effects and resilience to climate shocks and pandemic readiness, and how all these could in turn engender high-level impacts and support countries in the achievements of several of the SDGs. So then something that we did was, once the structure of the framework was established, we started to fill it up to map out the specific outcomes across those impact areas and the specific impacts coming from, again, the testimonials and the data and the evidence gathered in the Latin American study. So something that was interesting for us, and hopefully this image illustrates it, is that we can see that some of the impact areas, under some of these impact areas, we can see a very large range of outcomes. So we see, for example, in areas that are not necessarily covered by traditional school feeding programs, such as food supply chain, food environment, and so on. But also we see other areas where impacts so far are very specific and narrow, and we could think relatively easy to follow up, such as nutrition and health or education. Then something that was also evident is that while populating the framework, it became evident that for some impact areas, we really need further work to nail down more specifically how we can measure specific outcomes. So here an example of how people mention effect on resilience to climate shock or pandemic readiness. Something I want to show now in the second part of the presentation is, okay, we use the framework to map out outcomes and impacts and displays this broad scope of the homegrown school feeding programs, but then how can we use this? So we found two specific uses that we illustrate now. One is we can use this qualitative framework to somehow, for the moment, tackle the metrics challenge and show what the level of evidence available in a certain area or geographic scope, in this case, in the 12 Latin American countries. And we can also use this framework to tackle specific impacts on certain types of beneficiaries, or I would call it domains of action, depending on who you are, a specific stakeholder or national actor. So here, for example, I will quickly show you, we develop a traffic light system on these results of Latin America to highlight for which outcomes and impacts we do have good, and by good here we mean quantified evidence and available evidence of homegrown school feeding programs. So here we can see that only for some of the outcomes and impacts we found available and, let's say, good evidence in the Latin American countries reviews. Here we see that actually for most of the mapped out outcomes and impacts, the evidence is partial, and as Sarah mentioned before, mainly anecdotal or not quantified. And also we were able to find out which are, let's say, the more desert areas in terms of data availability. And here also an important message is that although they are key, there is really a big lack of data regarding impact on these cross-cutting issues. The second use of this framework that I illustrate here is it can allow us to really zoom in specific beneficiaries or specific impacts. For example, here, which are the impacts and outcomes benefiting directly children and schools are highlighted here. We can also see which are the potential benefits on households and communities, which are the benefits on smallholder farmers and local value chain players, or also which are the impacts, broader impacts in terms of civil society. So the current study basically, we think, is the real first systematic assessment of the level of evidence and gaps of homegrown school feeding programs. Impacts in those Latin American countries is a qualitative assessment, but it led us really to propose an analytical framework that we think can truly contribute to continue developing this type of tool. Indeed, future work is needed, and it's already planned with WFP and the network of countries that have contributed to continue the validation and improvement of this framework. And definitely a next step that we wish to pursue is also to work on defining standard and actionable metrics of this to measure these homegrown school feeding impacts. And coming back to what Dan was mentioning at the beginning, there's for sure lots of interesting interaction with communities of practice already existing on metrics around the School Meal Coalition. And finally, hopefully, this illustration could show you that the framework will also hopefully support policy level engagement and foster interactional and interinstitutional coordination, which is so much needed to continue implementing and scaling further these homegrown school feeding programs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Osana, for this excellent presentation. It's great to see how you're able to track impacts across actors at the school feeding value chain level, and how these gaps at least are mostly around food environments and diets at the moment. So I hope these presentations will provide food for thought and stimulate discussion for the next half of the session. And I'm conscious that we only have 25 minutes left. So I would actually now move to our next session and invite our panelists to join us. So with us today, we have from our co-conveners to this session, Mehrdad Ehsani, who is the Rockefeller Foundation's Managing Director for the Food Initiative in Africa. Welcome, Mehrdad. We have Professor Don Bundy. I'll introduce you again, Don. So from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and Director of the Global Research Consortium for School Health and Nutrition. And last but not least, among us, we have Dr. Mark Lundy, one of our research directors at the Alliance, where he leads the Global Food Environment and Consumer Behavior team. Hi, Don. Welcome to this session. So just to try and jazz things up a little, the panel will follow a fishbowl type format. So I'll be asking each of you a question in turn. You will have 3 minutes to respond to this question, and Sharon will actually be alerting you in the chat box when your time is up. So after these 3 minutes, if any one of the panelists feel that they have some pressing addition or pressing additional insight they would like to contribute, they can just jump in and complement the information provided by the main speaker. So I would start with Mark. Mark, I would actually latch on to what Osana and Sarah have highlighted about the need for establishing the evidence and the metrics, which at the moment is currently lacking. So they have highlighted that one of the limits identified in evaluating homegrown school feeding programs is actually the lack of consistent and comparable data that allows us to assess the benefits of this approach at multiple levels. So at the levels also of the actors within this food value chain. So based on this recently concluded assessment, what do you think are the key metrics that are most critical? And how can they be measured consistently? Who should be measuring them, and in such a way that can support the development of future homegrown school feeding approaches? Over to you, Mark. You have 3 minutes.
I will try to stay within the 3 minutes, Teresa. Thank you so much. First, congratulations to my colleagues. I think their presentations were very clear and very helpful. So I think there's several pieces to unpack here, Teresa. So one is, yes, around what to measure and how to measure it. The second is around who can measure it. And finally, for what purpose are we measuring it? So I think in terms of what we can measure, I don't want to repeat what Osana and Sarah have shared. I think there's a very broad overview that provides a lot of the key indicators, and obviously Dawn mentioned some at the outset as well. So I don't think we need to. I mean, I think we need to fully flesh out those indicators, and I think this is potentially one of the tasks of the community of practice that Dawn mentioned. Is okay. We understand we need to measure a broader set of indicators that look not only at the impacts on school children and at school, but also the upstream and the downstream, or the broader impacts. So we've presented, I think there's some of the ideas are there, but we need to have a conversation about which of that list of indicators that Osana presented, which I think are very complete, should be prioritized. So I think the first question there is, how do we have that exercise? Because measuring everything that's there would be ideal, but it may not be feasible in practice. So I think there's a question of going through and identifying and prioritizing in a collective manner what of those indicators we feel are most relevant. The second question about who does the measuring, I think, is equally important, because one of the challenges that we faced when we were doing the study in Latin America, and I think it's not uncommon globally, is to find that the data that is collected is generally collected around specific project interventions, a pilot project, a pilot program, something that's done differently someplace, But I think what we really need to think about is how do we transition the data collection of a limited number of indicators to national data collection systems that already exist. So I don't think we want to be inventing an entirely new approach of data collection that's outside of existing national level data exercises. So that means we need to be realistic about the number of indicators, coming back to my first point, but also identifying who in these countries is already gathering education or education and nutrition related indicators. And is it possible to incorporate into those existing systems 1, 2, 3, 5 additional indicators that could be picked up and managed in a robust and continuous fashion across, at a national scale, which I think is a second area. But again, I would say we need to use this as a design criteria that this needs to be built into existing data collection pieces. And then finally, the issue of who are we trying to, or what are we trying to use this data for? Again, I think the big question, if we're talking about moving to scale, is we need to convince those who are going to make decisions and invest in scaling these efforts about the value of this system. So Dawn mentioned the issue of value for money. And I think this, given that many of these programs need to be signed off on by the finance ministries or the people who are in charge of signing the checks, I think we need to really focus very clearly on simple indicators about what's the return on investment to these kind of programs, trying to put together a lot of these pieces we have about the broad impact, but putting it into a fairly simple number or figure that people can get their heads around. And I think this is the kind of work that we need to be doing going forward. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, John. You're exactly within the 3 minutes. So does Donald, would you like to provide any additional comments to what Mark just said?
No, I'm good. I'm good with what, in fact, Mark referred to a few things I'd said already. So I'm in the interest of time, I'm just going to go forward with that. Thank you.
And Mehrdad, anything compelling that you feel you need to add to what Mark just said?
No, I think you covered it very well.
Okay, Mark, you were comprehensive in your response. So in that case, let me move to the next question, which was actually directed to Donald, to Don Bundy. So this links to the challenges that are faced with regards to multi-sectoral collaboration. So we know that homegrown school, we've heard through the presentations of Osana and Sara that homegrown school feeding programs come in many shapes and sizes, decentralized, hybrid, centralized, and this depends largely on geography and the diversity of the national context. So despite these differences, one of the challenges, of course, is multi-sectoral collaboration and learning. Could you identify some promising ideas of how we might improve this cross-sectoral collaboration and learning, both at the national scale, but also across countries at regional and global scale? Over to you, Donald.
Super. Yeah, like my other colleagues here, I was knocked out by the presentations of Sarah and Asana. I thought they were really absolutely excellent, and a lot of it I didn't know. And when I think about the African Union's focus on homegrown school feeding, I'm pretty sure that information hasn't got over there in a clear, shared way yet either. And that's because we do work in silos. We work the different sectors we're in. We're doing there's excellent work going on, but we're not bringing it together. I was, if we look at the returns, for example, on school health and nutrition, on school meals programs, I was struck at a presentation earlier that the human capital part, so health and education sort of together. Michael Kramer, the Nobel laureate, was saying that in a study of school health in Kenya, that simply the tax returns, the additional tax returns on the greater income that people earned, paid for some of the, almost all of the programs that were involved in that. And unless we look across sectors, we don't pick up on things like that. The social protection role of school meals program was the main reason that many countries in the 2008 crisis invested in school meals, and we saw it again this time. That's why countries wanted to reopen schools. It's these are key things, and agriculture comes, I think, probably very near the top of the list in terms of the returns. And yet we don't aggregate these things, and we ignore we tend to ignore, gender, peacemaking, youth, indigenous communities. These are other big areas of return. Osana absolutely emphasized those, but we don't have a system of bringing those things together. Well, why not? Well, because we work in silos. That's how we work. That's how we work internationally. It's also how things work nationally. So to change that, you have to work in an extremely deliberate way to coordinate across these different silos. You need to be saying, your health, your responsibility is this bit. Your education, your responsibility is this bit. And instead of that, we just talk to individual sectors, and often we just are echo chambers, and there's no communication across. So what can we do about it? So one is be very deliberately seeking that. Two, at the international level, we need to set up things like communities of practice that talk to each other. So I'm just going to go back to that original theme. We in the Research Consortium would love to have a community of practice around this. We would love to build that in alongside health, alongside education. And so we present information together. And then at the national level, of course, the solution is to work at the parliamentarian level as well. I mean, work at the Ministry of Finance level because they look across everything. But the parliamentarians in particular don't have sectoral blindness because they're looking forward to supporting the people. Next week, we're talking to the parliamentarians at the ministerial meeting, and I would love to carry on, transfer that message to them. They are the guardians of multisectorality in our programming.
Thanks, Donald. I'd stop you there, and I'm going to ask Mark or Mehrdad if they would like to add any additional insights to what Donald just said. What can we do? Yeah,
I just add a very short one, and I think this is what Don has said is not only limited, obviously, to homegrown school feeding. I mean, this challenge of multisectorality is one that we're facing, particularly in the food system discussion as well. So again, I think to the extent that we can connect these, these fellow travelers, as it were, it would be much stronger, because I think there are a lot of these linkages that we need to highlight. And again, I fully agree with Don's comments about needing to work not only at the finance ministry level, but also at the level of parliamentarians. I think those are great points. Mehrdad, I don't know if you want to add anything else.
Sure. No, I mean, data is king, and being data driven is so important. And so we need more analysis and evidence generation. But I would also say we have to be cognizant of the reality that many of the low income countries are in real dire straits as far as public finances go. Some countries are spending more servicing their debts than they spend on agriculture. So we cannot solve this problem, I don't think, with data and evidence alone. It needs the lenders, it needs the multilateral development partners to come and look at the picture. I mean, countries sometimes just can't follow through, even if you show the best evidence. So I think we have to go on both fronts.
Thanks, Mehrdad. And that actually segues nicely into my next question. I think we can move on to the next question, which is directed to Mehrdad. So we've heard that we need different actors. It can't be solved just by countries alone, but we need the private sector and donors to come in. So essentially, I just want you to respond, or would like you to think about, how do you see these actors coming together to roll out the homegrown school feeding model at scale? So who plays what role to ensure success? Over to you, Mehrdad.
Thanks. So first of all, there's a lot of virtue in homegrown school feeding, but we don't have the luxury just to rest on our laurels and say, that's all we're going to do. We have to be inclusive in our procurement. We have to look at how we can be more gender sensitive, how the supply chain can become more resilient, more sustainable, more nutritious. So unfortunately, we have to walk and chew gum at the same time. There's so many crises, we can't just address one. So this implies also that governments embrace their leadership role, and procurers of food, to realize the power that is in their hands. In many ways, they hold the cards, because institutional markets can shape the food system. We've seen it. Look at the school feeding program, the school milk program in Kenya. It created a culture of dairy consumption it built a whole dairy industry in Kenya. And in fact, now it has resulted in a consumer base where Kenyans are among the highest per capita consumers of dairy products. And there's many, many cases you can look around the world. So I think we have to realize that the institutional markets can indeed give a very powerful signal to the supply chains to shift towards these sorts of outcomes that we all seek to be inclusive and sustainable and nutritious and resilient and gender sensitive and so many other things. So I think that there is a leadership role that those procurers of food have to play. That's one. I think though governments do need partners. We can't expect them to do all of this on their own. And so there are specific roles that funders and development partners and others can play. I think one of those roles is to fund the research and the data generation. So definitely we can't expect the research institutions to carry that load on their own. Definitely there is a role for buying down the risk for the private sector to try out some of these different changes. We found in Rwanda, when the World Food Programme shifted from refined maize meal to fortified whole maize meal, even though that's potentially on paper was budget neutral, still the millers needed technical assistance. Where do we source the equipment? How will we get the shelf life with these new formulations and so on and so on? They needed help with public education so that the consumers of this food, the school children, would understand why their food had changed. So I think there is a catalytic role that has to be played by development partners, but we can't create dependency. So it cannot be a long-term. It has to be something that embraces the transactional relationships that can happen between government and the private sector, and how can the development partners be a bridge builder in that process and make themselves obsolete as quickly as possible. I would also just finally say that we have to also be cognizant of the needs of the private sector, the incentives that they need, which the public sector can set for them. So I found it interesting that in Rwanda, for example, looking at one miller, Minimax, 5 years ago, only 20% of their maize was locally procured in Rwanda. However, with assistance to invest in post-harvest infrastructure so that they for use later on in the year, and with trade finance and that sort of support, they were able to, over a 5-year period, increase their local procurement to 80%. So I think we need to think about the kinds of assistance and incentives that the private sector need to come in and play that positive role, whether it's on inclusive procurement or the other elements of the food system that we seek.
Thank you, Mehrdad. And I'm just conscious that we have about 3 minutes left into the session. So I would like to thank you all for being here and creating such a dynamic and insightful discussion. And I hope this can help us move forward to the next phase. And I would at this point ask Mark, if you will, to take over and provide a final wrap up. You could help us summarize a little bit the results of our discussion today. You have 3 minutes.
In 30 seconds. Okay.
3 minutes.
Okay, 3 minutes. Okay. No, so thank you. First of all, thank you to everyone who's participated, the presenters, the panelists, obviously the participants who are on the webinar and listening to us today. Thank you so much for your time and your interest in this topic. So if I had to sum up what we've heard this morning, I guess I would say there's some interesting things that I would take away. First, clearly, as mentioned by several people, this idea of homegrown school feeding is important. It's growing. It's got high relevance for national governments. It seems to have positive benefits, but yet at the same time, we face this challenge of not being able to effectively clarify what are the benefits from these kind of approaches in a consistent, cross-cutting, ideally comparable way, even within countries, but certainly across countries at the global scale. So it seems to me that this idea that we've heard about the potential of putting together a community of practice to begin to drive these conversations forward and try to find these common grounds and ways of monitoring, measuring, and really assessing consistently what these programs can and cannot do. I come back to Mehrdad's point there that this is not the only way to achieve these goals, but it is one that I think shows a lot of promise. And then I would say the other piece that I'm taking away from the conversation this morning, I come back to this idea of this program of homegrown school feeding is, sits within a broader food system. And so to really understand how it sits and how it acts within this broader food system, we need to expand our lens. And we need to start thinking about precisely some of the issues that Mehrdad was just mentioning. So yes, there's a power in procurement, that's clear. There's a power in rule setting, and that's clear. And both of those sit very much with the public sector. But we need to think about how do we provide incentives and support for the other actors that are going to engage and support these kind of programs. How can we effectively use the evidence generated to improve their performance and improve their roles in the system? And again, the idea of trying to build effectively a business ecosystem around homegrown school feeding that includes everything from small producers who are also private sector through processing, through food preparation and delivery, et cetera, is really important. And then the other thing is to really think about this as a potential tool that not only achieves short-term goals in terms of nutrition and education, which I think are really, really important, but also contributes to long-term behavioral change. I thought Mehrdad's point about the dairy in Kenya is particularly relevant, and we've seen it elsewhere in Latin America, where the inclusion or the establishment and strengthening of homegrown school feeding programs really changes the perception of children and oftentimes households around what is healthy food and how to consume food, and really can begin to think about how to shift things. And just to close, I mean, I was shocked when I was in Vietnam about a month ago now, month and a half maybe, to be talking to the Ministry of Education and to see that in their new plan for 2022 to 2030, they've decided to reformulate from K through 12 their physical education component to be a wellness component, including issues around diet, dietary choice, nutrition, physical activity, a much broader conception that could ideally fit into these kind of homegrown school feeding programs, and I think be amenable. So again, I think the challenge is there's a lot of interest. Governments are interested, are working on the topic. We need to connect better, learn better together across the global South, and I think advance in ways that allow us to be more effective in delivering the multiple benefits from homegrown school feeding. So thank you very much today. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Mark. And I'd like to thank all panelists and participants for joining us today at this session. And with this, I'll close. Thank you.